today. So today I'm going to talk about my dissertation research, which I'll be defending in just a couple of months, on integrating ecological and genomic data for insect conservation in the Florida Keys. So a bit of background today. I'll start with ecological disturbances, which are enormously influential on many facets of natural systems. Disturbances include both natural and anthropogenic processes such as flooding, species invasions, and logging. Here in the southeastern US, as many of you are probably familiar with, our pine forests are fire disturbance ecosystems, and many organisms that inhabit these systems require periodic fire to maintain their populations. On the right here is just a visualization of a time series and how time since fire influences species composition and abundance. Populations of insects with their short generation times react quickly to disturbances. One of the most well understood groups of insects, butterflies, are often straightforward to identify just visually. These factors make them convenient for studies where you need to estimate population size many times in order to understand trends. These graphs here on the right show population size on the y-axis and time on the x-axis for two butterflies for which restoration of disturbance regimes was key to achieving species conservation goals. On the top here, the large blue butterfly in Great Britain, herbivore disturbance in the form of cows was reintroduced in their system, and then Fender's blue on the bottom was once thought to be extinct, but when fire was reintroduced to their prairie ecosystem in Oregon, they benefited quite a lot. Climate change is altering natural patterns of disturbance. Coastal ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to impacts like sea level rise and increasingly severe storms and other extreme weather events. One aspect of this global phenomenon, which is generally poorly understood, is how these climate change-related disturbances are impacting populations of organisms, particularly those of invertebrates. My dissertation comprises of a series of studies on two rare coastal butterflies in the Florida Keys, Palatka skipper, the little brown butterfly on the left, and Schaus swallowtail here on the right. I'll start with Klotz Palatka skipper, which is endemic to freshwater wetlands in the lower Florida Keys. We're talking about a habitat that occurs at about 1 meter above sea level in freshwater and brackish marshes. Although this subspecies is only found in the Florida Keys, it has a sister subspecies, which is common throughout much of the southeastern US. It has only one larval host plant, a sedge, which is called sawgrass. You might be familiar with it from the Everglades, where it's a dominant sedge. This butterfly is currently under consideration for listing under the US Endangered Species Act. It was petitioned back in 2011, but until the studies that I'm going to talk about today, we actually knew very little about this butterfly. So here's the range. So for those who may not be familiar, here we've got Florida, and then this pink box at the bottom is around the lower Florida Keys, so just a series of islands located south of Florida. And the rest of the map is sort of the zoomed in version of that, with the yellow polygons comprising the range of this butterfly. It's really only about 500 hectares of habitat in a very small geographic area. In this system, freshwater wetlands are dominated by grasses and sedges like sawgrass, and these plants require pretty fresh water, limited low salinity in order to grow and reproduce, although they can survive short periods of high salinity, such as like a storm surge from a hurricane or drought. This habitat is maintained by periodic fire. And although most of this habitat is located in protected areas, it is still impacted by humans. There's quite a lot of people who live just adjacent to these protected areas, several thousand people. There are roads that traverse this habitat, and this proximity to human infrastructure causes alteration of hydrology, and is also suppression of fire. And you may be wondering, if you're familiar with the Florida Keys, well known for the reef, other saltwater sorts of activities, you may be wondering, how does freshwater even occur? How does a whole freshwater ecosystem even occur in a place like that? And it really has to do with the geology, the porous limestone base here. Water can filter up through it, but because freshwater is less dense than saltwater, it forms what's called a freshwater lens, where the freshwater sits on top of the saltwater, and so creates a zone where the freshwater on top in, say, a wetland, as well as freshwater below the surface, is sitting on top of this seawater. And it's important to know that that fresh water, the only source of fresh water, is from precipitation. And of course, as sort of you can see in the diagram, if the seawater comes up through, say, a hurricane, that fresh water will have increased salinity. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about two studies with this butterfly. Firstly, I'm going to talk about a population genomics study we did to compare Palatka skipper in the Keys to its sister subspecies in mainland South Florida, to inform conservation management. So to do this, we collected a total of 95 samples from both the Florida Keys as well as up in mainland Florida. And since we were working with an imperiled butterfly, we did non-lethal sampling, which for butterflies comprises usually taking one leg from a live individual and re-releasing it. Butterflies live just fine with 5 legs instead of 6. We also collected non-destructive samples, which comprised of the shed pupal exuvia. So when a butterfly emerges as an adult from its pupa, or chrysalis, as you may be familiar with it, they leave behind tissue, and that stays in the environment for some time. So we took advantage of that and used those samples as well, since we encountered them in the environment more frequently than we encountered the butterfly. So then we took these samples back to the lab, extracted the DNA with a common DNA extraction kit, in this case, a modified OmniPrep kit. And then we extract the DNA, sequence DNA, using a technique called dd-RAD-seq. I won't get into the details of that for today, but essentially that technique generates a large number of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, that we can use to look at variations between individuals and populations. Although this technique, dd-RAD, doesn't require a reference genome, our results were improved by constructing a high quality genome, which we then use to align those SNPs. And that's currently paper under review. So unfortunately, our non-destructive sampling didn't work out as well as we had hoped. This chart here shows the unmapped reads, so the pieces of DNA that were not part of the butterfly, that it couldn't sort of say that, yes, this fragment of DNA belongs to this butterfly, which was much higher for these non-destructive samples. And that's likely due to contamination. Interestingly, we found contamination that included one parasitoid wasp, which makes sense since these samples are in the environment for months. So despite this reduced sampling size, multiple analyses clearly support that Palatka skipper in the Keys forms a group that is separate from the mainland group. And you can see that here with both an ancestry analysis as well as a PCA, that the Keys samples are well separated from the mainland samples. So next, I'm going to talk about our ecological study of population dynamics and habitat for this butterfly in the Florida Keys. And so to do that, we surveyed butterflies along transects using distance sampling. And so what that looks like, as you can see below, here's the transect, and then a trained observer, mainly robin in our case, who did a lot of swamp tromping, would measure the perpendicular distances. These dots represent where an organism was encountered. And basically you can feed all those encounters with their distances into a model and estimate density and abundance, so like population size of an organism. And while we sampled the butterflies, we also sampled vegetation along these transects. And we did this for 2 time periods. So there were folks out there, not me, in 2013, 2014, and then we went back out in 2021, 2024 to resample the same area, resulting in over 2,500 transects sampled. So first I'm going to talk about our plant data. So this comprised 210 paired vegetation sampling points. So that's points that we went to both in 2013 and in 2021. And we created 2 models, generalized least squared models, linear models that account for spatial autocorrelation at small scale, to look at the relationship between sawgrass abundance, shown here on the y-axis, and elevation on the x-axis. And pays particular attention, I realize these numbers are a little small. We're talking about elevation of 1 meter or less above sea level. And so in 2013, we found no relationship at all between elevation and sawgrass abundance. And just 8 years later, in 2021, we now see a significant and positive relationship between elevation and sawgrass abundance. And so to remind you guys, this is the sole host plant for this butterfly. And while we didn't collect data on salinity as part of this project throughout the whole study period, this is almost certainly due to decreased sawgrass abundance at those lower elevations due to increased salinity, which is really pretty striking to see over just 8 years. So the results, and I apologize, I realize this is a little hard to read here. This is for our butterfly surveys. What we found was that consistently higher abundances, of butterflies in 2013 and 2014 here at the top versus 2021 through 2024. So our density estimates in 2013 and 2014 ranged from about 20 to about 50 butterflies per hectare, while in 2021 and to 2024, these were over an order of magnitude lower of 0.4 to 4.6 butterflies per hectare. And while this data collection was sporadic and there are differences between observers and resulting in some large confidence intervals, these differences are pretty striking, especially when taken along with the plant data, that this is pretty concerning for this butterfly, that we're seeing much lower abundances of both the butterfly itself as well as changes in the host plant over less than a decade data that was collected over about a decade. And so I'll go back to this range map that we saw before. Here's this whole range that comprises a few hundred hectares in a small area. And then here's what that will look like under 60 centimeters of sea level rise, which is consistent with projections of sea level rise for about the year 2070. So as you can see, quite a lot of these islands will be underwater, including nearly all of the habitat of this butterfly, those yellow polygons. So the long-term outlook for this butterfly under sea level rise is pretty concerning. But it's not just this one little brown butterfly that is at risk here. These wetlands are home to a variety of rare and endemic species. I've shown just a few of them here. All of these are either directly require or indirectly require freshwater. Some of them are rather well known, such as the key deer here on the top left, while others are organisms we know nearly nothing about, such as the big pine conehead katydid here on the bottom left. And all of these and more are certainly threatened by sea level rise in this system. And so with these studies on Klotz-Palatka skipper, sort of the takeaway here is that this butterfly provides a good model to understand how sea level rise and other causes of increased salinity are altering freshwater ecosystems and allow us to watch that happen in essentially real time. And sort of the bigger picture is that studying places like the Florida Keys, which are on the front line of places vulnerable to climate change in the US, certainly can provide us with insights on climate change more broadly, and hopefully insights into climate change adaptation. Okay, so I know that one's a little bit of a bummer. This one's less of a bummer. We're going to move into the next butterfly I focused on for my dissertation, Schaus swallowtail butterfly, which is once again a South Florida endemic. It's only found in hardwood hammock forests in southeastern Florida. It has a couple of host plants in the citrus family. It was among the first insects to be listed as part of the Endangered Species Act, and it was listed as endangered due to threats from humans. Essentially, in the 20th century, South Florida underwent a massive increase in human population, and so factors related to that, including mainly habitat destruction, resulted in this butterfly being listed under the Endangered Species Act, and it has quite a cool looking caterpillar that I've shown here on the bottom right. So our objective with this project was to understand how does weather impact population dynamics of Schaus swallowtail butterfly. And to do that, we were looking at quite a long data set. Map. So here we have the US. In this red square is the range of Schaus swallowtail butterfly in southeastern Florida. And so this butterfly was once found from about Miami to Lower Matecumbe here at the bottom of the screen. So it was found on many of these islands. However, it is currently only found in a couple of these places, that being Biscayne National Park, here shown in the yellow dotted line, and Key Largo just to the south. And so this study was done just on Elliott Key, which is this inset island here on the right, panel B. And surveys for this study were conducted along a 6-kilometer length of trail shown here in the yellow line. And these surveys were conducted between 1985 and 2021. And so some history about this place. Elliott Key is currently part of Biscayne National Monument, but just before this land was acquired for conservation, it was held by private landowners who had hoped to court developers, and they actually cleared a large swath of forest. You can see here in 1973, they cut quite a lot of forest. And so we survey along this trail. That yellow line that I showed on the last slide is this skinnier trail here, which now looks more like the photo on the right. It's a pretty closed canopy forest, and this is a secondary growth forest. So this island shows evidence of human habitation since about the Neolithic period, and this forest was also cleared in the 19th century for agriculture, mainly pineapples and key lime trees. Okay, so our methods here, we were doing a capture, mark, recapture study. So we went out with nets, caught butterflies, marked them with individual identifiers, which in the case of butterflies, you can just write on them with Sharpies. As you can see what this looks like on the right, they all got individual identifiers. We re-released them and then would recapture them. And so when you do that, you can fit these data to Jolly-Sieber models in order to estimate population size. And we were able to do that for 23 years between 1985 and 2021. So then we took those population estimates and fit a series of exploratory linear models to try and understand which weather variables might be influencing these population dynamics. And some of these explanatory variables included things like temperature, precipitation, wind speed, as well as a density-dependent variable. And so here's what the 23 years of butterfly population estimates look like. You can see that butterfly population over this time period was highly variable. Some years, the highest year was over 10,000 individuals, whereas the lowest year was under 100 individuals estimated. And so despite the wide variation between years, we detected no trend across the entire data set. So the butterfly population on this island appears to be stable. But then what is influencing the trends we see? So in those exploratory models, consistently the top 2 predictive variables that we kept in the model were wind speed. So wind speed in the previous year. So this is looking at the directionality This top graph is looking at the directionality of our variables. So max wind speed in the year previous to data collection, or T-1, was consistently associated with lower populations, and maximum wind speeds in the 4 years prior to data collection were associated with higher butterfly populations. So what does this mean? This translated says that if there was really high wind, which is often a hurricane in this system in South Florida, the year previous to collecting data, we saw lower butterfly populations, whereas if that high wind event was several years previous, we saw higher populations. And so this bottom graph shows those same results from the last slide of the butterfly population. So butterfly population estimates here on the y-axis and on the x-axis year. But the only thing we've added here in these dotted lines are the years that major hurricanes made landfall in or near our study area. So you can see it in the data that in 1992, there was a big Hurricane Andrew. In the years following that, we see a decrease in butterfly abundance followed by an increase, sometimes to higher than the initial level before the hurricane. The same with Hurricane Wilma in 2005, an initial decrease, and then later an increase. And the same with Hurricane Irma in 2017. And although at this study, we really just collected data on the butterfly itself, there's a good body of evidence to say that the patterns we're seeing are due to how the hurricane disturbances and the impacts they have on the forest, and what that forest successional process looks like after a hurricane. So this is best studied in an experimental forest located in El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico, where they've been studying this for decades. So, different hurricanes, but similar dynamics here. So this photo on the left shows the forest just prior to Hurricane Maria. You see lots of trees. You can't see the ground in this photo. And then in this second photo after Hurricane Maria, obviously you can see the ground. The forest looks quite different. And after a hurricane, in the years as a forest recovers from a major hurricane, there's increased structural heterogeneity in the forest. So fallen trees, there's new growth of small trees. There's a lot more light hitting the forest floor. And there's also increased plant diversity. So plants taking advantage of this increased sunlight, and different plants that wouldn't have otherwise been able to grow there. And so what's been demonstrated in Puerto Rico is that these changes in forest structure impact populations of forest-dwelling insects. And so here's one of them from their studies, an herbivorous stick insect shown here in the photo. And you can see these results look strikingly similar to what we found in Schaus swallowtail butterfly in Florida. So after Hurricane George, with low populations, which then rebounded a few years later, the same with Hurricane Hugo in the late 80s, and it looks like the same trend happening with Hurricane Maria more recently. I will note that these trends, this relationship is often species specific. So it doesn't mean that like all insects are increasing in abundance in the same way after a hurricane disturbance, but just in certain cases, like in Schaus swallowtail and in this stick insect, that is the case, that they are reacting to hurricane disturbance. So coming back to South Florida, the most major hurricane to impact the system was Hurricane Andrew in 1992, a Category 5 storm, which made direct landfall on Elliott Key, shown here in the blue star. And that storm had major impacts. Nearly all of the island was submerged in seawater. All of the trees essentially lost their leaves. They were defoliated. Many trees, as you can see, fell down or were badly damaged. So it was a major concern for the conservation project of would this butterfly survive a major storm event like this? And it did manage to rebound just a few years later. And so then I, of course, was not there in 1992 during that storm, but later I was around for Hurricane Irma in 2017. So this storm, the center of the storm, was located further from our study site, once again, Elliott Key in the blue star, but it had a large wind field, so it impacted our site with tropical storm force winds. And so the picture on the left shows what the forest looked like about 2 weeks after that hurricane. See lots of trees down, a lot more light filtering down onto the forest floor. And then afterwards, in 2019, just a couple years later, a lot more shade, leaves, a lot more density in that plant structure. And so what we suspect is happening here is that the butterflies are benefiting from this increase in plant diversity and increase in diversity in forest structure. So after a hurricane, this increased light will lead to more flowers on the forest floor, which are an important source of energy in the form of nectar for butterflies. And also their host plants, which are understory trees here, have increased growth after a hurricane event. And so our main takeaway for this project is that tropical cyclones are important for shaping and maintaining biodiversity in many parts of the world. And this has really often been overlooked and merits further research. So I got here. I do still have a couple minutes. Okay. And just to talk a little bit about the larger conservation implications of this project, although it's encouraging that this butterfly's population on Elliott Key is remaining stable over time, the butterfly is still only found in a small area. So this project was done alongside efforts to rear this butterfly in captivity and release it into parts of its range where it is no longer found in the wild. Specifically, we're focused in the lower part of this historic range. And my last sort of take-home message is to just underline how important it is to have long-term data. Otherwise, you risk falling for what's called the snapshot effect. So once again, this is our full data set of population estimates for Schaus swallowtail butterfly. And this is over 36 years. And had we only been looking at this for just a few years in the early 90s, we would have concluded, wow, this butterfly is doing great. Mission accomplished. We can delist the butterfly, things will be fine here. And then we see the opposite thing here in the late 90s to the mid 2000s, right? Population is crashing. We get an opposite effect, right? I mean, it was very scary when this happened, right? For a population to fall to under 100 butterflies is really concerning. And it's really when you take the full data set that you can actually make sense of this, that, okay, it's highly variable, and it is concerning for conservation when the full population goes down to under 100, but it is capable, it is resilient to change and capable of staying essentially stable for over 30 years. And with that, there's a lot of people I'd like to acknowledge, primarily here my advisor, Jarrett Daniels, without whom I would definitely not have made it this far in my academic career, as well as the rest of my PhD supervisory committee, my co-authors, the many, many folks who have donated blood and sweat and tears to these projects. I guess this picture on the right is just showing somebody's hand getting absolutely demolished by mosquitoes. You can't wear bug spray if you're touching rare butterflies. So this is hard work. It is not all sunshine and rainbows when you work on butterflies. And so that includes, donning bug jackets in the heat, tromping through swamps, dozens and dozens of people over decades, as well as my lab mates. I won't read all these names, and funders, including National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Disney Conservation Fund, IFAS, CALS, School of Natural Resources Environment, Florida Museum of Natural History, the Florida Biodiversity Foundation, and the Peace River Butterfly Society, as well as my family, my very patient husband, and my parents. So thanks. And with that, the paper on hurricanes and Schaus swallowtails was published earlier this year. So there's a link to that if you're interested, as well as my contact information. And with that, I'll take questions. Yeah.
Okay, so I am not an entomologist, so just take this with a grain of salt, but the Schaus swallowtail looks a lot like the Palamedes swallowtail, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so, but based on what you're saying, I've never seen a Schaus swallowtail here in Gainesville. They're only Yeah, okay.
Correct, you have not seen
Just
it,
the Palamedes.
but we do have, well, there's a good number of swallowtail butterflies found here in Gainesville,
Just not that one.
just not this one.
Okay. All right. I'm just
Thanks.
curious.
Yeah.
There's someone here.
Great talk. Are there any predictions as to how the Shasta swallowtails are rebounding after this like massive storm surge events?
That's a really good question. We have some like thoughts that perhaps the pupae are actually able to survive inundation in saltwater. So that could be, I mean, it is sort of fascinating to think about like a massive storm like that like surely outright kills a bunch of butterflies. And then even if if a butterfly survives the initial hurricane, the lack of resources that are present afterwards, it really is very impressive. And we are not sure. I mean, really all we can sort of lean back aside from our thoughts on saltwater, is like enough of them must be surviving. It is possible that some butterflies are coming in, migrating in from another place, but really given the limited range of this butterfly and the fact that Elliott Key is where the highest number of these butterflies occur, like that seems less likely. And so some of them are somehow surviving. Oh, Todd, if you could unmute.
It's actually Andre, he's proctoring me. But I sent you an email with the location, time, everything for GPS stamping of a Strauss butterfly in Jacksonville. We have quite a few of them that fly around, and if you could confirm from the picture, there's a population up here. Or there, sorry. I'm at Whitney Lab right now.
Yeah, thanks. I'll definitely take a look at those pictures and get back to you. I will say that it's almost certainly a different species of butterfly.
Yeah, I looked at it closely. It's either a really good mimic or a subspecies, but yeah, if I find more pictures of them and I can find one that's dead or anything I can take very good close pictures of, I'll send you more.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely take a look at those photos. Thanks.
Sweet.
Yeah.
As far as like the first inset goes with the sea level rise and like the sawgrass and having a certain amount of tolerance to salinity, is there like any chance that with the rising sea level, the range of the sawgrass itself changes and creeps further inland, or is that just kind of
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry, I'm gonna go. This is jarring to watch. We'll go back to this range of the butterfly. So in many places, things can migrate upslope. It's certainly something that we're watching happen in the Everglades, right? The southern Everglades are getting saltier and saltier, and some of those plants are shifting northwards in the case of the Everglades. But here, there's very few places. Okay, here's the one with sea level rise. The blue there represents places that'll be inundated by seawater. There are a few places that the sawgrass could move a little bit upslope, but really in these islands, the maximum elevation is like 3 meters, 2-3 meters above sea level. And at some point, that freshwater lens that I talked about, where the freshwater floats on top of the saltwater, that will eventually, I'm not a geologist or hydrologist, but my understanding is that eventually that freshwater lens will fail. Like if the seawater is so high, there's like nowhere for that freshwater to sit. So in this case, it does seem unlikely, but thank you very much for bringing that up. There are a lot of cases where things are able to migrate upslope.
There's a question in the chat. I don't know if you kind of touched on the answer just now, but.
I'll just read it out from Tiffany, who says, is it possible to have Palatka skipper reach northern Keys, or do you think that sea level rise will soon consume that area? Yeah, so the question rather, this one's instead of about migration of the host plant, this is about my movement of the butterfly. And so it will be kind of interesting to see in the coming decades what happens, because currently, as we saw with that genomic study, The butterfly in the mainland, even not separated by such a huge difference, like in about the Everglades, just a couple 100 miles away, is distinct. They are different from those in the Florida Keys, and as such, they are separate subspecies. And that actually does extend to Key Largo. It's still that same mainland subspecies, even in the upper Keys. And that habitat doesn't actually exist throughout in the middle and upper Keys. That those sawgrass wetlands that I spent time talking about are rather rare. And because of the geology, that habitat doesn't exist in other places in the Keys. So, you know, best case scenario, maybe they mix with the mainland populations at some point. But these butterflies aren't known to move long distances. So yeah, thanks, Tiffany, for the question. And with that, it seems like I'm out of time. So thanks, guys. Thanks so much, and thanks for your questions.